cowboy bought a mail-order bride, but a Lakota chief arrived to take her away. The train came crawling through the plains like a wounded beast, hissing and clattering as though it resented the land it crossed. Eli Ward stood near the edge of the platform, hat in hand, boots half buried in red dust that glowed warm beneath the noon sun. He'd waited 3 months for this moment, each day a stretch of silence broken only by the creak of his empty porch and the wind that carried no laughter home. When the last car shuddered to a halt, a few travelers stepped down, merchants, soldiers, mothers with restless children. But it was the final figure who made him forget how to breathe. She moved carefully, one hand clutching a worn satchel, the other shading her eyes from the light. Her dress was plain but clean, her hair dark as wet soil, braided down her back with a single white feather tied near the end. The letter had called her Annika, and the promise had said she'd come willing. But now, as she looked around the station with quiet dread, Eli wondered if anyone ever truly came willing to a place as lonely as his. He stepped forward, voice catching. "You're Miss Annika?" She nodded faintly, her gaze drifting past him toward the horses tied at the post. "You're the man who sent for me?" "Yes, ma'am. Eli Ward. Ranch is about an hour's ride." He tried to smile, but it felt like a sin. "You'll be safe there." She hesitated, the feather in her hair trembling in the breeze. "Safe," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. A group of men nearby chuckled low, watching them, the kind of laughter that stripped dignity off a person. Eli turned slightly, shoulders broadening, eyes warning. The laughter stopped. "Your trunk here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Everything I own's right here." He looked at the satchel, small enough to hold regret and little else. "Then we'll make the rest together," he said, and lifted her onto the wagon seat as though she weighed nothing. The road stretched endless ahead, gold and green under the fierce sun. For a while they rode in silence, the rhythm of the wheels filling the spaces between words they hadn't found yet. "You ever been this far west?" he asked finally. "Once," she said, "when my people still called it home." The way she said it made him glance over, but she didn't meet his eyes. Somewhere behind her calm voice, he heard the echo of something unfinished, something that didn't belong to him. He didn't know it yet. But the past she carried would ride faster than any horse he owned. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had softened into amber, and the prairie seemed to breathe again after a long, harsh day. The house stood simple and square against the horizon, its chimney dark, its windows open to the wind. Eli helped Annika down from the wagon, his hand rough, her fingers light as she steadied herself. "Ain't much," he said quietly, embarrassed by the emptiness around him. "Just walls, wood, and a roof that leaks when it rains." She looked at the house for a long moment, then said, "It's more than most." Inside, she moved like someone learning to breathe in a strange dream, touching the table, the hearth, the cold stove, as though trying to remember what belonging felt like. Eli brought in her small satchel and set it near the bed. When he turned, she was standing by the mantel, staring at the single item placed there, a faded photograph of a woman holding a little boy. "Your wife?" she asked softly. "Was," he said, the word catching like gravel. "She and our boy didn't make it through the fever." She nodded, lowering her eyes. "Then maybe this house knows sorrow as well as I do." He wanted to ask her what kind of sorrow, but her tone made him still. Instead, he stoked the fire, the orange light catching the white feather in her hair. It shimmered faintly, almost alive. "That feather mean something?" he asked. She turned slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time. It means I'm not lost. You got family still? Somewhere, she said, but they don't know where I am. The fire crackled between them, and for a moment it felt like two worlds were meeting across it. He took off his hat and set it aside. You'll have a room of your own. I'll sleep out by the barn if it makes you easier. I'm not afraid of you, she said, surprising him. Then what are you afraid of? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the feather from her braid and laid it on the mantel beside the photograph. So they both remember, she murmured. Later, when he stepped outside to check the horses, he saw a column of smoke far to the east, rising slow and thin. It wasn't from his land. It was from somewhere deeper in the plains. He thought little of it then, but by dawn that same smoke would bring the past to his doorstep. The morning broke sharp and bright, the kind of light that showed everything as it truly was. Eli had been up since before dawn, mending the corral fence, when the sound came. A faint rhythm under the wind, steady as thunder still too far to see. He turned toward the east, eyes narrowing. At first it looked like heat shimmer. Then shapes began to rise from the horizon. Riders, half a dozen at least, moving fast. Annika stepped out onto the porch, the hem of her dress brushing against the worn boards, her face pale in the sun. Those are Lakota, she said quietly, not with fear but with certainty. How do you know? He asked, though the question was already foolish. Because I was born among them, she answered, her hand gripping the rail. And because that smoke you saw last night, it was a signal. Eli felt something tighten in his chest. They following you. She nodded once. Not to harm me, but to take me back. He wiped the sweat from his brow, staring at the distant riders. Ain't nobody taking someone from my land without talking first. You bought me, she said suddenly, her voice trembling but firm. You think that means they'll see you as anything but another man who claims what isn't his? The words hit hard because they were true. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, jaw clenched. I never meant for you to feel owned, he said at last. Then let them see that, she replied. The riders were close now, their horses kicking dust into gold ribbons beneath the sun. At their lead rode an older man draped in a red blanket, his black hair streaked with silver, his bearing proud as a mountain. Annika's breath caught. Wikasa, she whispered. My father. Eli stepped forward, hand resting on the butt of his revolver, not from threat, but habit. The chief dismounted slowly, eyes sweeping across the ranch before resting on Annika. He said something in Lakota, his voice deep and calm. She answered, the words flowing like a song Eli couldn't understand. Wikasa's gaze shifted to him then, steady, unreadable. You are the man who keeps what is not his? He said in halting English. Eli met his eyes. I'm the man who gives what he can't keep. The chief studied him a long moment, then turned to his daughter. Then let us see what his heart holds when the sun sets. By afternoon, the riders had set up camp beyond the creek, their horses grazing where the grass ran long and silver. The air smelled of smoke and sage, and the sound of Lakota voices carried faintly through the heat. Eli spent the day in silence, splitting wood he didn't need, fixing hinges that weren't broken, anything to keep his hands busy while his mind refused to rest. Annika moved quietly through the house, preparing food she barely touched, her face unreadable. As the sun leaned west, she stood in the doorway. He will come speak with you, she said softly. He doesn't want blood. He wants truth. Eli nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. Truth's hard to trade when everyone's already picked their price. She looked at him then, her eyes gentler than her words. You think this is about trade? It's about honor. Same thing out here, he muttered, setting down the axe. When Wicasa finally crossed the creek, the evening light caught the red in his blanket, making him look carved from the fire itself. He stopped a few paces from Eli, studying him with the patience of a man who had seen too much of both pride and regret. You treat her well? The chief asked. I try, Eli said. Then why did you pay for her like cattle? Eli's throat tightened. Because I didn't know another way to ask for company without being laughed at. Wicasa nodded slowly, his expression neither anger nor forgiveness. A man who is alone too long forgets the language of asking. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. She is not a thing to be kept. She is blood of my blood. But she has walked too far between worlds. Now the land must decide where she belongs. Eli's jaw clenched. The land don't decide. People do. And I ain't the kind who gives up what ain't done wrong. Wicasa's eyes glimmered with something between respect and warning. Then you are the kind who learns the hard way. The chief turned back toward his camp, and for a moment Eli thought the matter settled. But when Annika appeared beside him, tears shining on her cheeks, he realized the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. He says the tribe will return at dawn, she whispered. To take me home or take your pride instead. Eli looked toward the fading light, the land stretching endless and quiet. And knew sleep wouldn't come easy that night. The night hung heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the restless shifting of horses outside. Eli sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, though he prayed he'd never have to use it. The stars burned sharp and bright above him, each one a reminder that no man truly owned the land beneath his boots. Inside, Annika lay awake, watching the shadows dance along the wall. She could hear him outside, breathing slow, steady like a man waiting for judgment. When the first light bled into the horizon, a line of riders appeared again. 20 this time, their silhouettes cutting against the dawn like carved stone. At their head was Wicasa, riding bareback, his long braids streaked with white, his face set in quiet resolve. Eli rose slowly, leaving the rifle leaning by the door. Don't, Annika whispered as she stepped out behind him. They will see it as challenge. Ain't a challenge if a man stands with his hands open, he said, his voice rough but calm. The chief dismounted as the others fanned out across the edge of the yard. You were warned, he said. You chose pride. No, Eli replied. I chose not to let fear do my talking. The two men faced each other, the world holding its breath between them. Annika moved forward, placing herself in the space where sunlight spilled over both their shadows. If you want to take me, she said to her father, then you'll take me from where I stand, not from what I am. The old chief's eyes softened, but only for a moment. You belong to your people, he said. I belong where my heart remembers kindness, she answered. Eli's chest tightened at her words, but he didn't speak. Wicasa turned to his warriors and lifted his hand, signaling them to hold. Then show us, he said quietly, if this man's kindness can stand against the weight of our memory. Without another word, he took a step back and motioned toward the open field. 2 horses were brought forward, one for Eli, one for Annika. Ride with her, the chief said. If she still looks back when the sun reaches the ridge, she stays with you. If not, she comes home. The test was old, sacred, cruel in its simplicity. Annika looked at Eli, her breath catching. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "don't follow me if I turn away." He met her gaze steady and unflinching. "Then you best hold tight, 'cause I don't plan on letting go." They rode in silence beneath a sky so wide it seemed to listen. The horses moved side by side through grass that shimmered silver in the morning sun, their shadows stretching long across the earth. Behind them, the Lakota riders followed at a distance, solemn as witnesses. Annika's braid whipped in the wind, the white feather at its end catching every glint of light, a small defiance against the vastness around them. Eli kept his eyes forward, hands loose on the reins, fighting the knot in his chest that felt too much like fear. "You don't have to do this," he murmured. "Yes, I do," she said. "This is the only way to end it." "End it how? By choosing one world and losing the other?" She looked at him then, and the pain in her eyes was older than either of them. "Both my worlds already took from me. Maybe it's time I give something back." They reached the rise where the earth began to climb toward the ridge. The sun was higher now, painting the rocks in red and gold. Wikasa's voice carried from behind. "Ride on," he called. "Let truth choose." Annika dug her heels in gently, her horse surging forward. Eli followed, matching her pace as the wind roared past. For a while, it felt less like a test and more like escape. The rhythm of hooves, the scent of dust, the wild freedom that neither of them had ever truly known. But when they reached the crest, Annika slowed. She turned in her saddle, looking down at her people waiting below. The sun caught her face, and Eli saw her trembling. "You can still go back," he said, his voice low. "You'd be safer there." "And what about you?" she asked. "You think I'm safe anywhere else?" He didn't answer. She looked toward her father and then back to him. "When I was a child," she whispered, "my mother told me the wind carries the truth if you're brave enough to hear it." The wind swept between them then, cold and clean, and carried the scent of wood smoke and river water. She closed her eyes, took one deep breath, and turned her horse. Not toward the tribe, but toward Eli. Down the ridge, the chief bowed his head, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. The riders behind him lowered their weapons. When Annika reached Eli's side again, she said, "I guess the wind chose for me." He smiled, the first real one in years, and together they rode back toward the light. When they returned to the ranch, the land seemed changed, wider, quieter, as if even the earth understood that something sacred had been decided. The Lakota riders stopped at the creek, their horses lowering their heads to drink. Wikasa dismounted without a word and began to walk toward the house, the red blanket trailing like a banner of old pride laid to rest. Eli waited on the porch, his hands still, his rifle forgotten against the rail. Annika stood beside him, the sun warming the ribbon of her braid, her face a mixture of strength and uncertainty. The chief paused a few steps away, his gaze moving from his daughter to the man beside her. "The ridge has spoken," he said finally. "But I did not come only to see where her heart would turn." His tone shifted, softened, deepened. "I came to see if mercy could live where pain was born." Eli nodded slowly, unsure whether the words were meant for him or for the world itself. "I ain't ever been a man of speeches," he said, "but I reckon the land don't need more blood." Wikasa stepped closer, the lines in his face catching the light like the rings of an old tree. "My people once thought all white men were thieves," he said. "But today I have seen one who gives instead of takes." He reached into his blanket and withdrew a small carved feather made of bone. "This belonged to my wife," he said. "She wore it when she prayed for our daughter's return. If you keep her safe, this belongs to you." Eli hesitated, then took it carefully, feeling its weight as though it carried every story ever buried in the plains. "I'll guard her with my life," he said quietly. Wicasa looked at Annika. "You are free, child. But remember, freedom does not mean forgetting." She nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "I will remember both worlds." The chief raised his hand in farewell, and his riders turned their horses westward. The wind caught their departure like a whisper of old ghosts, finally at peace. When the last of them vanished over the horizon, Eli looked down at the small feather resting in his palm. "Strange thing," he said softly. "Never thought mercy could feel this heavy." Annika smiled faintly. "That's because it isn't light, it's earned." The fire inside the house had burned low, its last embers glowing against the shadows, and for the first time, the silence between them felt like home instead of loss. For 2 days, the land lay still, the air heavy with quiet that wasn't peace, but something close to it. Then word came. Riders from the nearby town had seen soldiers moving east, claiming Lakota had raided a freight wagon. Eli knew the story was a lie before Annika even spoke. "They'll come here," she said, her voice thin. "They'll think my father led it." He stared out toward the plains where the horizon blurred into heat. "Then we'll be ready." That night, he saddled both horses and packed what little they could carry. But Annika shook her head. "Running will only prove them right. Staying proves nothing but how fast a bullet travels," he muttered. She stepped close, her hand on his chest. "If we hide, they'll burn the land between us. If we stand, maybe someone finally learns to stop hating ghosts." Her words burned with truth he couldn't fight. By dawn, the first shots cracked across the valley. Dust kicked up like smoke as a handful of soldiers rode hard toward the ranch, shouting for them to come out. Eli stepped into the open yard, his rifle hanging at his side. "There's no fight here," he called. The captain, red-faced and drunk on authority, sneered. "Then why's there an Indian woman on your porch?" Annika stood tall behind him, unflinching. "Because I live here," she said. "Because this land remembers my name." The soldiers laughed, but the sound faltered when a second line of riders appeared over the ridge. Wicasa and his men, silent as the dawn. They didn't draw weapons, only sat their horses in grim watch. The captain's hand twitched toward his gun. Eli stepped forward, his voice cutting through the wind. "You want blood, you'll get it. But it won't change your story." The standoff hung like a held breath. Then, one by one, the soldiers lowered their rifles, uneasy under the weight of eyes older and steadier than theirs. The captain spat, turned his horse, and rode off without another word. When the dust settled, Eli let out a long breath he hadn't known he was holding. Wicasa nodded once from his saddle. "Sometimes," he said, "the land itself chooses who stands upon it." Annika's hand slipped into Eli's, her fingers warm, sure. "And sometimes," she whispered, "it forgives them both." The chief turned away then, leading his riders into the west, leaving behind peace born not from victory, but from understanding that no side truly owned the horizon. The storm that followed was soft, almost tender, washing the dust from the grass and turning the dry creek into a ribbon of silver. Eli and Annika worked through it, clearing debris from the fence, patching the roof where bullets had torn through the boards. Rain clung to her lashes like glass, her laughter breaking through the sound of thunder. You ever think the land's trying to start over? She asked. Reckon it's doing a better job than most of us, he said, smiling faintly as he handed her another plank. When the clouds finally thinned, the light that spilled across the ranch looked new, like the world had decided to forgive itself. Annika walked to the edge of the field where the creek now ran, kneeling to cup the water in her hands. It ran cool and clear, carrying reflections of the sky. When I was little, she said softly, my mother told me the river remembers everyone who's ever crossed it. She said if you listen long enough, it tells you who you've become. Eli came to stand beside her, watching the current wind through the grass. What's it say now? He asked. She smiled faintly. That I stopped running. He looked at her then, realizing just how much ground she'd covered to find peace. The sound of distant hooves made them turn. Wicasa again, this time alone. He rode slow, his horse slick with rain. I came to see if the land kept its promise, he said, dismounting. It did, Annika replied, her voice firm but kind. The old man looked around, his gaze softening at the sight of the rebuilt fence, the smoke rising steady from the chimney. Your mother would have smiled to see this, he said. You've made peace where the soil once bled. He pulled from his pouch a handful of small river stones, smooth and dark. We place these where new stories begin, he explained, setting them by the creek's edge. Let the water remember. Eli crouched beside him, pressing one of the stones into the mud. Then maybe it'll remember us right, he said. Wicasa nodded once. It will, if you keep listening. The chief mounted again, his expression proud and at ease. As he rode away, the sun broke fully through the clouds, scattering gold across the wet earth. Annika leaned against Eli, her voice a whisper. He came to take me once. Now he just came to see me home. And as the river whispered around the stones, the land finally sounded like it belonged to both of them. Weeks later, the grass rose high again around the fence lines, waving in soft ripples of gold beneath the calm blue sky. The ranch had begun to hum with quiet life. Fresh paint on the barn, the smell of bread in the air, the gentle murmur of the creek in the distance. Eli sat on the porch, mending a bridle, while Annika knelt beside the hearth inside, feeding small sticks to the fire. The cabin glowed with evening light, the smoke curling lazily through the chimney. Feels strange, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Waking up and not wondering who's coming for me next. Eli smiled faintly. Strange ain't bad. Just means you lived long enough to earn peace. She looked up at him, her eyes catching the firelight. And you? You ever feel like you earned it? He paused, setting the bridle down. Don't reckon a man ever earns it. He just tries not to break it once it finds him. She stood then, walking to the doorway, where the last streaks of daylight touched her skin. My father used to say peace and mercy are like the same fire. They both need tending. Then we'll keep it lit, Eli said softly. He rose and joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they looked out toward the endless plains. The rebuilt corral gleamed faintly in the dusk, the horses grazing near the water. When I first came here, she murmured, I thought this place would bury me. Now it feels like it's breathing for me. He nodded, his voice low. Maybe that's what happens when two broken things meet. They remember how to live. The night settled gentle around them, the air warm and still. Crickets began to sing, and far off, a lone coyote called. Not in warning, but as if to mark the end of something long fought. Inside, the fire burned steady, its glow painting the walls with soft amber. Annika took down the carved feather Wikasa had given Eli and placed it beside the river stones on the mantel. "So they'll all remember," she said. "The old world and the new." Eli looked at her, the quiet strength in her face, the peace she'd brought into his lonely house. "They will," he whispered, "because you're part of both." And as the last light faded, he kissed her forehead, slow and certain, the kind of touch that belonged to no side but theirs. Outside, the stars rose clean over the land. No smoke, no dust, no war. Only the steady glow of a fire that had learned how to last. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Crimson West. If peace asked you to choose between where you were born and where your heart finally rests, would you have the courage to stay? Tell us in the comments below.